Welcome to the James Connolly Forum. It's going to be in French tonight.
I hope there's English translation.
I'm Joe Lombardo, and I'll be chairing tonight. I guess most people know me. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace, which is a co-sponsor of the forum, and the Troy Area Labor Council, which is a co-sponsor of the forum. I'm the national co-coordinator of UNAC, United National Anti-War Coalition, and I'm also a member of the Solidarity Singers, which is political music. I'm sure most of you have heard us before. Tonight's forum is called Politics, Protest, and Music, and John Halle is our speaker. He's the Director of Studies in Music Theory and Practice at Bard College. He is active both as a composer and a theorist. Recent compositions have been performed by many ensembles around. He's a founding member of Common Sense, Composers Collective, which will release its third CD on the Albany label. I'm also aware there is an Albany label. And his Mortgaging the Earth, based on text from Lawrence Summers, has received more than 20 performances. He was previously on the faculty of Yale University. He is twice elected as a Green Party member to the New Haven Board of Aldermen, where he sponsored resolutions opposing the war on Iraq, anti-dumping ordinances, and legislation in support of the Yale unions during the 2002 Yale strike. So we'll hear John's presentation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some announcements, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So here's John.
What a joy to be here, and what a great idea for a series, for a forum series. As you'll see, I'm going to focus on things like this, which used to be really common 50, 60, 70 years ago, which is to say when labor really had a function in people's lives and a real meaning, a central role in people's lives, a really important central role. And things like this, you know, where speakers would come in and address various union locals and talk about political subjects, but also aesthetic questions and philosophical questions and even scientific questions were completely the norm back then. This was part of the discoveries that I made in researching this topic, and so we'll get to that in a second. So it's a particular joy to talk to you guys in this context. It's really what a wonderful idea. Thanks a lot for John for inviting me to this thing. This is the first time I'm doing this, so it won't be the most polished talk in the world, but I think, you know, we can talk about some of the issues, loose ends that come up in the question session. I hope that you can maybe help me tie a lot of them together, because I'm sure a lot of you know more about this stuff than I do. No question, you know, given the background of people that come to these meetings, as I've seen from watching some of the videos that have been done here already, which have been great. Okay, so what this talk came out of was a paper that I wrote called Composers and the Plutocracy, which was about composers or classical musicians' relationship to the Occupy movement when it was going about a year and a half ago. And I was really involved in that, and I sort of discovered that like almost nobody that I knew was. In other words, I would go to Zuccotti Park and I would see nobody that I knew. And it kind of, when you sort of thought about it, it made a certain kind of sense. Okay, even though like artists are really poor, composers make absolutely no money, like we're totally desperate, you know, we're like subaltern on one level. On another level, we're at least the tops of our professions are hobnobbing with guys like this. Okay, on some level, we're more directly connected to guys like this than your average Joe. And who are these guys? You know this guy, okay, everybody knows him,
Mayor
right?
Bloomberg,
That's
yeah.
Mayor Bloomberg, okay? Mayor Bloomberg gives tons of money to the arts, most of it anonymously, okay? And he calls in his chips in really brutal ways that you would not know about because it's anonymous. And I'll give you an example. This article was supposed to be published in a journal called New Music Box, which is like the leading composer's web journal, okay? They read it, they said, the editor said, oh, we love it, we're going to publish it, okay? And then, but we have to run it by our CEO first, okay? They ran it by their CEO, he says, no, we cannot possibly run this because it's too well researched and it names names. In particular, it names the name of Mayor Bloomberg, this article here. And they said, we can't possibly touch this because he'll get pissed off and he'll threaten to withdraw his money. Okay? That's totally, he does that kind of thing all the time. And if you want to see a couple instances, you can read that article and you'll find out all about him. This guy is a little bit better known. Okay? That's Sanford Weill, the former head of Citibank, you know, who like ran away with the U.S. Treasury a few years ago, you know, after like passing laws to deregulate the financial industry through his buddies in the Clinton administration, mainly Robert Rubin. Okay, that's Sanford Weill. He's the head of Carnegie Hall. You know, he runs Carnegie Hall. He's the top guy. Yeah, that's what he moved on to after destroying the country. He now runs, okay? So that's him. This guy, you ever seen him?
No.
Henry Kravis of Kravis, Kohlberg, and Roberts, the leading corporate buyout firm from the 1980s, you know, the Predators Ball, like the first kind of generation of corporate crooks. You know, he was one of the big guys in that. He, for example, gives his money to the New York Philharmonic for the Henry Kravis Composers Fellowship, which finances a composer, one lucky composer to write a couple pieces for the New York Philharmonic over a couple of years. So, you know, you get that. I mean, I know the guy who got it, Anthony Chung, you know, he's very grateful to Henry Kravis, you know, and I would be grateful to Henry Kravis too if I got that commission. I'm not going to get it, but, you know, I would be, you know, so, and I would have, and he meets Henry Kravis, and, you know, Henry Kravis, like, gives him the check, and he shakes hands, and they, you know, exchange small talk. So, you know, we occasionally have connections with these two kinds of guys that average Joes don't, okay? So that's why we sort of have a sense that we're connected to the kind of plutocratic class more so than other people. And of course, okay, it's wrong, but, you know, we sort of feel some sympathy. And then guys like this, you know, like Pal Joan, who I teach with, you know, she sees these guys all the time. John Adams, another well-known composer, John Priliano, you know, they move in those circles when you get to the absolute top of the profession. You're sort of running around with plutocrats. You're not making plutocrat salaries, but you see them, okay? So, okay, you know, but we sort of feel like we're connected to them because, you know, well, sometimes we went to fancy colleges, we're generally sort of middle class or upper to middle class, and we think like them because, as John Cage said famously, composers are people who tell other people what to do, right? Meaning we write these scores, you know, and we tell, like, the violinist, you know, play this note with an up-bow there, you know, and whatever, you know, the drummer has to play exactly at that spot. So we're sort of in an executive position. So we're sort of, in that sense, we're in the same kind of emotional world, at least if you're a super controlling kind of composer, which a lot of us are, okay? So there's sort of some connections to be made, okay? So there's that, but then, of course, there's our history, right? Okay, you know, so there's our history, which is, you know, like if you were, say, you know, Haydn, you were working in the court of Esterházy, right, and you wore a military uniform, right? You were actually like an officer in the, you know, and you were expected to behave according to the court, the codes of behavior of the court, you know, or if you were Bach, at least at the beginning of his career, you know, you had these similar kinds of positions, and this is the drum roll symphony by Haydn, actually which he wrote in London, but which the King of England attended, so, you know, performance of. So, we have those kinds of connections, and, you know, when you were in those positions, you know, you lived in places like this. I mean, of course, you lived like way down here, somewhere, way over here. But, you know, you got into the garden, you could see the sculptures, you know, you're sort of treated pretty well compared to a lot of other people. okay? But you have to know how to behave, right? And so, like, here is Bach's dedication page to the Brandenburg Concertos, and this is how you have to talk to people, right? You know, as I had the good fortune a few years ago to be heard by your Royal Highness, and, you know, blah, 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 takes some pleasure in the little talents which heaven has given me for music, and taking leave, you know, of your Royal Highness, and to honor me with the command to send, you know, the most gracious orders, blah, blah, blah. This is called flattery, right? Which back then was not a pejorative, right? It was, you know, sort of, this is the way that you have to address, you know, the people like that. And it still happens, I should say, you know. I mean, there's still flattery. It's done somewhat more subtly, but, you know, this is what was expected kind of code of behavior, you know. So you either did this or you got that, you know. Yeah, I mean, and this actually happened to Bach a couple of times, right? When he mouthed off to his patron in Dresden, he spent a couple of weeks in the dungeon. You know, he actually left his position too early, and he was in prison. You know, so and you know, famously Mozart, right, mouthing off to the Archbishop of Salzburg. You know, I mean, the legend is the Salzburg Archbishop kicked him in the rear end and, you know, forced him to leave under very humiliating circumstances. So, you know, you had to know your place, right, you know, in the royal courts, and they behaved according to their place, more or less, or, you know, just suffered the consequences, okay? So, but, you know, of course, the kings were very aware that composers posed a kind of a threat, especially the really good ones, because there's something really magical about what a guy like Bach or Haydn or Mozart can do. And they sort of communicate to people very directly, and they're in a position where they can potentially be pretty destabilizing, as has been demonstrated throughout history. You know, artists really have the ability to lead movements or play a really important part. So rulers had to be aware of that, you know, sort of that kind of unique status that composers had, and they were careful with the way that they treated them. Okay, so as the 19th century went on, composers were able to increasingly detach themselves from courts. And what allowed them to do that was, of course, the growth of the middle classes and cities and the bourgeois class, which meant that composers could play for big audiences, or pianists could play for big audiences and could make money that way, like selling tickets to their concerts. And so that allowed them to kind of make their way and cut their ties with the royal courts, though they still continued to have connections with them throughout the 19th century, okay? Or they could publish increasingly, right? So they print these scores, and, you know, since there weren't recordings back then, if you wanted music in your house, you know, you have to get a piece of music and you have to learn how to play it on the piano, and that's, you know, was the equivalent to like turning on the radio now or download or whatever, pressing a button on iTunes. Back then, you wanted music, you had to create it, and if you wanted Beethoven, you had to play it from, you know, the Beethoven piano sonata, which, like, Proust's mother, you know, would receive. It's recorded, you know, she would receive the Beethoven sonatas as they were published. You know, she subscribed to them, and she could play them all up to the Hammerklavier. This, I think, is sort of interesting. That's how good the pianist Proust's mother was, right? I mean, Hammerklavier was the first one that was too hard, that she couldn't manage, okay? So it's, I mean, a high level of musical culture, and there's a great deal of interest in these kinds of things, and composers were able to finance their careers and themselves through publications and increasingly cut themselves off from the courts, okay? And eventually recordings, you know, even towards the second half of the 19th century, they got established, and the musicians could make their money that way. And some of them got really rich, okay? Like Verdi and Tchaikovsky, you know, these are really wealthy, I mean, real money, not just like moving in elevated circles. They were, I mean, Mahler's letters. When Mahler met Tchaikovsky, said he was impressed by how rich he was. You know, that's what Mahler's, yeah. He's very nice and very rich. That's how Mahler described Tchaikovsky, okay? So, okay, you know, so, but, you know, live by the free market, right? You know, die by the free market too, right? So when the shit hits the fan, when the economy goes down the tubes, you can't sell your product as much and you have trouble, and so whatever, you end up doing that, right? And so when you no longer have the royal court that's like footing your bills, you increase, in the 19th century, and increasingly in the 20th century, there's a recognition that, that it's, there's actually a problem with the system. It's not just individuals that are, me as an individual that's having problems. It's like the whole problem is systemic. And so by the first, the first depression of recent, or the Great Depression, you started having this rather interesting phenomena, which is you started getting composers who were genuinely radical. Now, composers traditionally have been pretty right-wing, okay? And so here you have Hitler, and here you have Wagner's two sons, right? Or grandsons there, yeah, your two grandsons, okay? And here you have Stravinsky, and he says, I don't believe there's anybody who venerates Mussolini more than I do. Similar remarks from Webern, similar remarks from other composers. I don't want to say this is universally true, but generally composers are right-wing, and it makes sense because, you're hobnobbing with rich people, you feel that they have there's some legitimacy to their access to wealth and privilege, and you associate themselves with them, and you get the crumbs from their table. So that's why you tend to be right-wing. So in general, they were, but during the first depression, during the 1930s depression, you started getting composers who were genuinely radical. And here's one, okay? Not so well known today, but this guy is named Hans Eisler. He was a German composer, and he lived in this country for some years after getting kicked out of Germany for being communist by the Third Reich. Spent some time in New York City, and he got involved with a group of American composers who had an organization called the Composers Collective. And here are some of their members. This is a composer named Henry Cowell. Some of you might vaguely know his name. He wrote very interesting music for the prepared piano and for using your sort of elbows and your fists, but also some very interesting, nice tuneful music based on Irish folk songs. Gosh, I should have brought some of his music. It's really nice. Here's another one. This guy's name is Earl Robinson. Okay, he was also a member of the composer, and this is, for those who don't know, Paul Robeson, of course, okay? And so he wrote this hit song, which was done first by Robeson, then Frank Sinatra, called Ballad for Americans, okay? As I say, he was part of this group called the Composers Collective. He was actually the first winner of a Composers Collective competition for a workman's song. In exchange, and this was done for the Communist Party, won. In exchange, he got a year of lessons with, not this guy, okay, who you will now know. I should move it forward a little, because this guy.
For the average man, what is it? That's who it is, right? Who is it?
I don't mean this to be a quiz. It's just funny to do name that tune in whatever 10 minutes, right? Okay.
For the common man.
There you go. Fanfare for the common man. That's Aaron Copland.
Yeah.
Okay. He was also a member of this group of composers, the Composers Collective, the best known, certainly. Yes. But another well-known member was this guy, Mark Blitzstein, who wrote, there was a musical called The Cradle Will Rock, that there was a movie about with Kim Robbins a few years ago. Not bad, pretty well done, actually, yeah, okay. A student, or very influenced by Eisler, incidentally. Right, and so now all of these guys were members of the CP at the time. They're all, this was not something the least bit unusual, didn't really even merit comment, and what they were about was you know, seeking, and this is from Copeland's biography, right, seeking to find a style of music that was appropriate to the Marxist revolution, right? And so here is a song, you know, what Copeland, now Copeland later sort of somewhat repudiated his beliefs at the time, but he was very involved, and this is what he calls his communist song, Into the Streets, May 1st, okay, for Men's Chorus, and now somewhat effective anthem, but you know, for reasons we could talk about, not sort of maybe the ideal, in the ideal style that you would want to function in, as an anthem should, but this is his communist song, okay? And so the issue was that these guys said, okay, well, we're going to write music, you know, that's for the Marxist revolution, right? Meaning we're going to write, you know, music for the workers. We're going to kind of accept that what the working man, you know, gets, as Big Bill Haywood said, that nothing is too good for the working class, right? That everything that the working class gets should be on the highest possible level of quality, right? So, but that sort of starts to get kind of problematic when you think about it, right? Quality according to who, you know? The best according to who? Well, back then it wasn't considered that problematic because, of course, the best music was classical music, meaning the classics, Beethoven, Brahms, you know, and also contemporary music, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, that kind of thing. So if you want to provide the working class with the best, well, that's what you have to provide for them. Okay? That's what you have to, you know, now, of course, this raises the issue that, you know, about what kind of music it was going to be. Well, here's a piece that like was a competitor for that title, okay? I'll play it. This is a video, actually, that I got from YouTube. This is a piece by a composer named Mosolov called The Iron Foundry, okay? Okay? And this is a classic piece of Soviet futurism. And the idea is that there's a certain kind of musical modernism that's sort of dissonant and irregular in some ways, but it captures the essence of the machine age. And back then, machines were thought of as being very liberatory, right? Because, you know, the machines would eventually replace the workers, and we would all be able to work 5-hour days, you know, based on that once the workers have seized control of the means of production. So we want to celebrate machines, and this is how we're going to celebrate it. Okay? Well, this is a great piece, actually. Russian futurism.
But it seems hard to dance to.
Maybe, but it does kind of have a beat. It has some kind of a groove to it, you know. I mean, it's pretty dissonant. But it's, as you'll see, it's different from other forms of musical modernism, you know. And if you have to kind of sell modernism to the worker, you know, I think you'd be better off with that, than, say, this piece here, okay? I'll play some. Now, this is one of Eisler's pieces, okay? And now remember, the objective is, we're trying to provide the working class with the best possible, not necessarily what they would like, right? But the best. That's different, right? I mean, it's, now we don't sort of make that distinction, but back then it was pretty, nobody would argue with you if you said there's a difference between music that people like and music that was good. Okay, I'm not defending that position, I'm just saying that was the position. And what you want to provide the worker with is the best, okay? And so here's what Eisler was producing at the time. Okay, it's the Piano Sonata number 3, first movement. Variant of modernism, much more similar to the music of the so-called Second Viennese School composers. For those of you who know, this is the composer Arnold Schoenberg, and his two students Anton Webern and Alban Berg. Eisler was a Schoenberg student, and even though he was somewhat dismissive of Schoenberg's bourgeois tendencies, he respected him. He is a quote-unquote a musical giant. And so he very much wanted to incorporate the most advanced and profound tendencies of contemporary classical music, and he thought this is what the workers should have, right? You want to provide them with the best, this is the kind of thing you want to provide them with, okay? So that's one, okay? That's another possibility for, what is going to be the worker, what's going to be kind of the music, the best, nothing's too good for the working class, okay, this is what we're going to give them, okay? But then, well, let's get real. The Soviet national anthem, right? As a friend of mine said, the Soviet Union obliterates all other nations in the production of anthem technologies. And this is a guy named, what's his name? This is the Red Army Chorus. And this was composed by the leader of the Red Army Corps. Of course, I want to say Andropov, but it's not Andropov. Andropov is a different, I'm blanking on his name, but he wrote lots of pieces in this basic style, extremely tonal, extremely regular, wonderfully done. I mean, absolutely splendid. You can get all the Red Army Choruses videos on YouTube now. They're wonderful, to watch. And so if you want to make a case for music for the workers, here's one of your options, okay? Let's just say, all right? Well, maybe, let's say, none of those really won in this country. We all know who won, okay? And here's who won, right? What's that? I mean, this is who won, let's say. Yeah. Okay, that's who won.
This land is your land, and this land is my land. From the California to the New York Island.
Well, let's just say, it's the thing. That's who won.
Stream waters.
That's who won. That's who won. This is workers' music, okay?
That's right.
Or that's who sort of won the philosophical aesthetic battle, okay? But there's more, you know, there's a story kind of behind the scenes, which is that there was an argument about this, you know, within the Communist Party and within composers and intellectuals, and they, you know, really had serious discussions about what would be the music for the masses. And now the composers, the members of the Composers Collective had various ideas about this subject. And as you'll see later, there's another member of the Composers Collective who I didn't have a picture of, but I should have included. And you wouldn't have recognized the picture, but maybe I'll scroll forward to it so that you can see. It's this guy.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you know who that is?
Pizza here?
No, you're good. He's very good. This is Pete.
Yeah.
Okay, that is
Charles?
his dad, Charles. Right? That's his dad, Charles, who was a member of the Composers Collective. That group of composers, the same group of composers. Yeah. He was also the critic of the Daily Worker. Yeah. Prior to that, he'd been a professor of musicology at UC Berkeley, where he was removed for opposing the First World War. Okay, he lost his position, moved to New York. He then married a composer named Ruth Crawford. Ruth Crawford Seeger, very well-known composer, and he ultimately, I mean, if you look at his writings at the time, which we might have some time to sort of talk about later, he articulated this idea that, you know, the way that musical culture should be judged is not by its peaks, right? Its peaks of achievement, meaning its production of recognized masterpieces, but by the general level of musical participation of the individual, of the entire society. So it's not enough, you know, that you have like a lot of that you produced a Beethoven or you produced a Brahms, and it's not really even all that important. That's like saying, you know, the way that you judge an economy is based on how many billionaires it produces, right? That's not the way you judge an economy, obviously. We know that, right? The way you judge an economy is whether it makes use of the abilities of every individual and whether it rewards them with what they need, right? All according to their abilities, to them according to their needs. That's the only rational way to judge an economy. You don't judge it based on extreme rewards that are provided to those who, for whatever reason, are judged to be the most able, okay? That was his view, and of course, if you want music to participate in, you know, that's what you want to do, and that's why he won. You know, I mean, there was an intellectual position that kind of the victory, the folk revolution was based on. It wasn't just, you know, like people liked it. I mean, people really thought about these things back then, let's say. Okay, so now I'll go back a step, you know, to say that, well, but that, you know, it's not as if all workers necessarily just wanted this, you know, just like wanted simple tunes and completely rejected the Eislerian notion that they should be provided with the best, okay? And so here are a couple of remarks that will give you some ideas about this, right? So this is from, you know, so we all know that Guthrie won, you know, but not Seeger. But is that really what the workers wanted? Well, okay, here's a book by Stanley Aronowitz where he's talking about his working class Jewish father and grandfather. And he said, high art was the only possible cultural legacy for a working class that sought to transcend the degraded conditions of its subordinate existence. Okay? So what he means by that essentially is that the idea of cultural impoverishment and economic impoverishment were linked. You know? So there was a recognition among the working class that they were not just, you know, living under deprived conditions, their quality of life was minimal, but that also they didn't have the ability to appreciate a certain kind of sophistication and quality, okay? Which didn't mean, you know, that they should reject the idea of quality and sophistication. It means that they should be able to achieve it too. Okay? And that the goal of the working class movement was to provide them with access to that. Okay? And so here's another guy, kind of a right-wing guy named Joe Queenan, who's a journalist, and he says sort of something similar, right? That his working class background, for him, serious music was important, not only because it was mysterious and beautiful, but because it confirmed that I had cut my ties with the proletariat. Right, that she was able to rise out of a kind of proletarian condition, okay? Now here's my favorite quote of all, okay? This is a guy, does anybody know this guy? His name is Jerry Monaco, anybody? He's from Schenectady. He's from, I just found this on the internet, and it's such a wonderful, he contributed this comment to Doug Henwood's news group a couple of years ago, okay? I mean, it's, yeah, right? So he said he was, you know, he's from Schenectady, and here's what he, you know, his experience was that, you know, the town was ruled by General Electric, Catholic Church, the Democratic machine, and the Union local, okay? And people had an eye for quality. My great-grandfather could tell you why Verdi was good, and Puccini was like adding sugar to honey. And my great-uncle Tony could tell you why Louis Armstrong was great, why I like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday, why so many other popular singers were empty. Now, but here's the great spot. Uncle Tony never graduated from high school. But he did take classes in classical music at the local Union Hall, right? He belonged to a reading group at the Union Hall and read poetry. You know, yes, there was a poetry group for the factory workers at the Union Hall in Schenectady, New York. Right? You know, I tend to think that because such people were around, I learned to appreciate quality. Right? So there was a genuine. Sorry?
Probably came out of the socialist mayor's reign.
In Schenectady, right? There was a social, right? Yeah. So this is all of a piece, right? But you know, notice this is the idea is, you know, the working class had workers, who we call, you know, it sort of sounds odd to say that now, but let's just say, you know, there was a genuine hunger for being provided with to be provided with the access to culture, and some of them really appreciated having it, okay? Here's some more examples, okay? There was a whole system of Communist Party schools that were set up, right? There was one called, the flagship one was in New York, the Thomas Jefferson School for Social Science. It had 10,000 students in, I think, 1946 or something like that, or 44. Huge numbers of students went to this school, okay? And it was mostly social science classes, history, economics, Marxist economics, of course, sociology. But there were also music classes, and they were taught by Wallingford Rieger, very distinguished composer, right? Mark Blitzstein, who we mentioned previously, he taught at this school. Sidney Finkelstein, who was a well-known journalist and academic. And Charles Seeger, who was Pete's father, but also previously a professor of musicology at UC Berkeley. And then now this actually comes from the House Un-American Activities Committee testimony about which these schools were all shut down during the McCarthy period. They just, and in fact, it's even hard to find any information about them. The blacklisting was so total, right? I mean, I found, you find 20 Google hits for a school that had 10,000 students, right? Completely unimaginable, right? So, so this is from the testimony, and they describe classes that this guy, Dr. Joachim Schumacher, who was a German immigrant, he taught on the bourgeois musical culture in the period of monopoly capitalism and the topography of Carl Maria von Weber. Okay, this was they're very dismissive and condescending about this in the House American Activities hearings. I thought I'd love to take those classes. You know? It's exactly the class I would like to have had offered to me when I was at Columbia. You know, right? So people taught them. Took these classes. Large numbers of people taught them, and that's why, you know, up to only a few years ago, you know, you would see substantial numbers of working class people at classical concerts in New York City. It wasn't just people like Sanford Weill and Mayor Bloomberg. I mean, there were working class people that had genuine interest in this music and really could appreciate it on its own terms. And that's, when you have 10,000 students at a school like this, that's a good part of the reason, okay? Well, what else? The ILGWU had something called Unity House. And this was a retreat in the Poconos in Pennsylvania. And this is a Life magazine article. Oh, sorry, it's a bit blurry here. But, you know, here you can see them. So they had I think there's another picture here. Oh, yeah. Let's see. It had a 12,000-seat concert hall where they gave, where there was a hired orchestra that performed there for most of the summer. They had theatrical productions. They had a 2,000-volume library. And, you know, unfortunately, this picture, you can't really see it, but, you know, so these are union workers over here. They look like my Bard students, right? You know, here's a guy, you know, with sunglasses and chino pants. I mean, they don't just look like affluent and glamorous, they look like hipsters, you know? They look like, you know,
What year was that?
1938. 1938, right? At this glorious retreat, you know, and it also this is a Life magazine article about this, right, where this was covered, and the article describes them a kind of an imaginary movie scenario where a boy meets a girl and they argue about Marx. You know, or something, you know, they argue about radical philosophy, you know, and they go to the library and they check out books on, you know, by Lenin or something. That's what this was about, right? You know, that was what the scene was. Now, here's the next one. So the ILGWU sponsored a musical on Broadway that was called Pins and Needles, okay, in which the recorded version, which I think released in the 50s, featured as the lead singer Barbra Streisand.
Really?
That was Barbra Streisand's first recording, was the ILGW, okay? And these are radical songs, okay? I should have brought some of them, but they're songs about strikes and songs about plutocrats and songs about unions and the union and that kind of thing. Here's the original cast over here, and this is kind of a fun story. The woman in the middle in white, her name is Doris Rabinowitz. She's the mother of David Graeber. You know David Graeber, the author of the book Debt, the First 5,000 Years, who's credited with the slogan, "We are the 99%. That's David's mother.
Who's on the billboard behind them?
These are great union leaders. I think Debs is back here, you know, of John L. Lewis, people like that. Yeah, these are okay. So, right, so now this is, again, you know, this is worker education and providing the workers with culture. Now, did it work? Well, some people say yes, some people say no. Okay, so here's a report about Unity House from a consultant they brought in. And they said, yeah, had too much culture, classical music, heavy drama, and surreal dancing, and they better lighten it up with lowbrow humor. And eventually, in fact, they did pretty much get rid of the kind of highbrow cultural element at Unity House by the 60s and late 70s. Okay, so again, Guthrie won. You know, Eisler lost, right? But, you know, it was not so, it was not a total victory, like, right away. Yeah?
Well, I'm just thinking, I mean,
in between that time is the McCarthy years, so.
That's right.
You know.
Right, that's right.
It
Well,
wasn't
but
victory, it was influence.
well, I mean, it's high culture that lost, right? In other words, it was high culture that lost the battle for the hearts of the working man, let's say.
You
Now
think absent the McCarthy years, that would have been
That's an
the
interesting
result?
question. Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, no, that's what we should talk about, right? I mean, you want my answer to what I kind of feel?
Yeah.
No, I think if you hadn't had McCarthy, you would, right? That's. I mean, I'm writing a paper about this now. I mean, basically, I'll write up this talk, and that will be kind of, and I'll get to that in a second, right? A little bit more, right? But in any case, that's, the sort of working class high culture did kind of collapse to some extent, or it was not as vibrant, sometime in the 50s and the 60s, it went into decline, okay? So, okay, well, who lost? Classical music lost. Well, who won? Well, jazz, right? And you see a shift, in fact, in the Daily Worker, increasingly in the 40s and the 50s, where they try to promote jazz as a kind of the indigenous, authentic people's classical music. And notice this is a book by Sidney Finkelstein, right, who we mentioned before. This is one of the first kind of scholarly treatments of jazz, where it takes the idiom seriously as a legitimate form of art music, which eventually found its way into the stultifying seriousness with which jazz is taken now, with academic departments in jazz studies and a whole infrastructure of support that's very similar to the one that supports classical music. So jazz won on the one side, and then but mainly this guy won, which is Charles, who you don't know, and this guy, of course, who you do know.
Debout les dames de la terre, debout les forces de la faim, parlez en centre à terre, c'est l'éruption de la fin. Du passé fait dans ta plaza, pour l'esclave, debout.
So he won, okay?
But he also tried to teach people in his concerts how to read music. And sing
He did.
Hallelujah, the classical
For the
music.
purpose of, so that they could do it for themselves.
Well, he was thrilled with it, though. He said, "This is great stuff, folks.
Yep.
You guys should learn how to do this."
You should learn how to do it for
He was
yourself.
into it.
That's
And
right,
he
that's
still
right.
is.
Yeah, he's still, absolutely, he still is, yeah.
Yeah, he's an
Yeah.
interesting
It's funny,
guy.
I saw him, he came into our local coffee shop in Red Hook a couple of weeks ago while I was writing this article,
Oh, wow. Oh, my God.
I just couldn't bring myself to talk with, there he was, with, 4 generations of his family or something like that. It's beautiful, wonderful people, the Seekers, okay? So he won, okay? But, what also won was something, I'm sort of make this transition more in the paper, but what also won is a kind of change in the kind of social context of performing, right? Where trivially, performers in folk music or pop music or rock music, they don't go on stage in tuxes, obviously. They dress in t-shirts and in jeans and sneakers, right? Or, baseball caps. Audiences are expected to participate to some extent and engage as audience members. You're welcome to yell or scream or something like that during your favorite part of the song, right? Whereas in classical music, there's an enforced code of silence and discipline among the audience, right? And so, in a way, what that ultimately led to was, this kind of thing, right? Which is huge, really participatory audiences and music that projects and is expected, where all of these mannerisms that were excluded from the concert hall previously shouts and hollers and screams, you know, now are part of it. And it's sort of like, well, we're going to liberate our kind of, we're going to our kind of thumb in the eye of elite culture is to no longer kind of enforce their codes of behavior, right? So, and so pretty much people recognize that, right? And now everybody kind of takes for granted that it's classical concerts are just a pain in the ass. You hate them, you know. Nobody likes going to them because, you know, you have to like sit down and it's so repressed and horrible, right? So here's a letter to the New York Times. You know, a guy wrote, "For the past 40 years, rock has taught us that emoting and participating with our bodies and voices are part of the show. You can't do that in a concert hall. The entire society dresses informally now. Concerts still involve formal wear by the audience. If back in the 1890s, you know, it's like back then, you know, people were all uptight then, you know, these sort of elite, uptight people are what dominated concert life now. They no longer do. Their codes of behavior no longer dominate the sort of concert life. And so in a way you could say that the working class, you know, they won the concert hall, right? But what did they lose? So they won the concert hall. Well, these are wages. Okay? So that guy says for the last 40 years, right, you know, rock has taught us, you know, you've had this kind of transcendence of rock and its kind of working class ethos in the concert hall, right? But for exactly those 40 years, this is what's happened to wages. Okay? This gets to your point. Is this a coincidence? You know, is this a coincidence? Are these completely unrelated phenomena? I don't think they are, if you want to know. That's my opinion, okay? But that's all I have to say about it. Right? Okay, that's the end.
Before we get into questions, let's see about announcements. John, do you want to talk about the next forums?
Yeah, the next forum will be on April 8th with Fred Magdoff from Monthly Review, talking about about the environment and capitalism and resource depletion. I think a lot of you know who Fred is, and we're all looking forward to that. So, and then in May we're having Jeff Perry talking about Dwight Allen's book on the creation of the white race, which should be quite interesting as well. And I'm working on a forum on the Civil War for June, but I haven't finalized it yet. This is what is it? Mary, help me out here. This is the 100 and something year for the Civil War?
50.
150th?
Well, it starts off in 1861.
Yes.
Right.
150 for the Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, this year is Gettysburg.
150 for Emancipation Proclamation.
Right. So anyway, I thought we ought to do one on the Civil War, and the historian I'm talking to has written a book on the Union Army and race. So anyway, that's what's coming up. Then we take a break over the summer. We'll see what we can do in the fall.
Trudy, do you want to?
Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace is sponsoring a bus out to a conference and a rally and a protest that will be out at Hancock Field in Syracuse, New York, a protest against drones. So we're hoping that you'll join us for the bus. You can go for the whole weekend, but the bus will be going out on Sunday, April 28th, leaving Albany at 9 a.m., returning around 5. You can either see me about that before we go tonight, or you can go to our website, which is BethlehemForPeace.org. Please consider joining us for that. It's about $30 for the bus, but you can go for $15. So please.
And Hancock Base is where a lot of the drones are flown from that are killing people in Afghanistan. Dorothy.
Yeah, I just wanted to announce next Saturday night that we're going to be showing Harlan County, USA, the award-winning documentary about coal miner strike in Kentucky. What's the year of that? Anyway, it won an Academy Award. It's a classic film. Oh, wow. Great music in this too. Yeah, and that's going to be at the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Albany, the Unitarian Church in Albany. Saturday, March 23rd at 7:30, and the flyers are on the table back there.
Any other announcements? Well, Occupy and some others will be sponsoring a May Day actions on May Day. And we're planning them now, and Monday, the next meeting will be at Occupy office in downtown Albany on Monday at 7 o'clock. Anything else anybody else has? So I'm going to let John call on people himself so I can just stay out of the way in this process. So please raise your hand if you'd like to say something or have questions or comments.
Yeah.
Well, as you were talking, I don't want to be argumentative, but you make the point that Woody Guthrie and the Seegers are embraced by the working class, and I would almost say really, because I mean, my co-workers really don't look to that music. You know, they don't. It's a little too. I mean, it's kind of more the activist class that does. My co-workers look to more rock and. You know, really, I'm not sure my co-workers would even know who Woody Guthrie is.
Yeah.
They would know the famous songs,
Yeah.
the big ones.
Well, you know, when Bruce Springsteen did the Woody Guthrie.
Right. So, I mean, I don't know if that's a change historic. I mean, was there a time when the working class really did embrace those songs? Or was it really sort of the intelligentsia and the... I just
Yeah, no, good point. No, I think I might not have been clear. I think how I would formulate it is, that's what the intelligentsia thought would be the product that they could sell to the working class. Now, whether it was picked up was another question. Certainly there was the folk music revolution in the 50s, when for a period prior to the rock revolution, it was genuinely popular. So, for example, the group The Weavers, right? That Pete Seeger kind of had his hit tunes like Good Night Irene, you know, and also Woody Guthrie songs like Pastures of Plenty, you know. That was genuinely popular in the sense that it really did sell records, lots of them, and it got on the hit parade. But 10 years later, there was the rock revolution, which infamously began and can be dated, depending on how you want to date it, to Bob Dylan's electrified appearance at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, when he brought an amplified band. And interestingly, there are stories about Pete Seeger that he was very dismissive of it. He claims he actually wasn't. However, the issue was that he brought his father there, Charles. And Charles was had a hearing aid and was having difficulty hearing the music because it was so loud.
What Pete said was he couldn't hear the lyrics.
He couldn't hear the lyrics,
and
exactly.
it wasn't a band, it was just...
Well, it was the Butterfield Blues Band.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, it was the members, Mike Bloomfield, and the members of the Butterfield Blues Band who accompanied Dylan on Maggie's Farm. And you can get, that's on YouTube. You can see that now, okay? So, you know, that was, so rock music pretty much obliterated folk as a commercial genre, you know, by the mid to late 60s. Though, you know, you had a few hang-ons here and there. Now, whether Charles would approve of this, incidentally, is an interesting question, right? Which is, you know, something to speculate on. Yeah?
I mean, even during the height of the highbrow type classical music, wasn't there always folk music and jigs and reels and dancing and balalaikas and different kinds of music that more the common folk dealt with?
It depends on the year, right? So, I mean, there were certainly classical composers, particularly modernist composers, like those of the Second Viennese School, who, or even later, post-war modernist composers like Pierre Boulez and Stockhausen, and who really tried to exclude from their music anything that made any kind of reference to the world outside of that genre. You know, I mean, you're not going to find, there's a kind of attempt to kind of purify the discipline. But you're certainly right that composers like Bartók, right, national, you know, wrote pieces of variations on folk songs, were constantly incorporating folk elements into their music. But crucially, within a modernist language. See? So, meaning the harmonies would be quite dissonant and thorny. You know, you would hear the melodies, but they would be kind of dressed up in a modernist, in modernist costumes. So you could even make the argument, I would say, or certainly classical composers have made the argument, that when the idiom sort of lost its bearings, when it did cut its ties, you know, to the kind of indigenous music of.
But there always was indigenous music, which the common folk or the working class probably understood, and you know, as part of like music that you work to, you sang on, you know, and stuff like that. And
Absolutely,
that was more
right,
of a,
right. Yeah, I mean, you find it in Beethoven, certainly. You know, I mean, Beethoven has Scottish folk song variations. I mean, the Pastoral Symphony. You know, but you could, right.
But what I'm questioning is, and I'm certainly not a professor of music or anything like that, but what I question is, because there was always, let's label it folk music, music of the people. It was music of that time period, music of that expression. So as the world progressed and things progressed and politics changed, the people and the music, granted, then you had your classical, your Baroque, and all your early music and stuff. But I'm talking a little bit before, and we get up to both parts where all that comes, and then you have the political, and you still have the people. So when you're talking and you say to me, and I'm not questioning, but you say, oh, well, Seeger won. No, I always felt that the people always had their music too. Mm-hmm. And it all depended on where people were in politics, what was going on in our own country, in our own cities, in our own communities, but there was always the people there. Now, if you wanted to have the government start ruling the people and dictating the people, you're going to see these balances go back and forth. But I'm not sure if I agree with, I like your idea with, oh, well, the classical music was the music of the rich, and that was a beautiful way that you kind of integrated all of that. But at the same time, I just don't, there was always the music of the people.
No, there was certainly indigenous, you know, folk music. But when I say that classical music was the music of the rich.
I wouldn't say folk music. I mean, if we want to label it folk music, it's kind of, that makes it really narrow. It was music of the people.
Right. But, you know, you have to keep in mind that even a composer like Schoenberg, who was born in 1872, he didn't hear an orchestra until he was 21 years old. Okay? Right? And there was a reason for that. He couldn't afford it.
Right, I understand what you're saying.
And prior to that, you know, like if you wanted to hear an orchestra, there wasn't some concert hall, like there wasn't, you know, the Troy Music Hall that you could like pay some amount of money to and listen to a concert. If you wanted to hear an orchestra, it was in the court. That was it.
Right.
You wanted to hear an orchestra, you got an invitation to the court. That's the only way. So people really were excluded from that music. Now, whether, you know, which of course they had their own music, and it had a high level of sophistication, you know, for sure. We don't know about it, right? And there's a reason why we don't know about it. Because we didn't have recordings, and also it wasn't written down, you know? Because in musical, I mean, classical music has that advantage in that it's notated. You know, the overwhelming majority of the world's music isn't written down on paper, you know? John. Sorry. Let's talk later about it. It's a good.
I think the essence of your argument, and I tend to agree with it, is that the workers' interest in, you know, challenging high culture coincided with a crest of the workers' movement in the 30s, and the decline in interest paralleled the McCarthy period, the depoliticization of the working class, and lowest common denominator, top 40, et cetera, et cetera. Because as Nancy said, it's hard to argue today that Pete Seeger represents music of the working class. The working class isn't the top 40 or golden oldies or whatever. That's what they listen to. Or hip hop, maybe. Hip hop you might call currently for young people folk music.
Yeah.
But the Guthrie, Seeger, Popular Front era music is not music of the folk today.
Yeah, well, I just want to draw a little bit of it, I just want to make clear about the distinction within the Popular Front, right? Which is to say that you had the Seeger Guthrie wing, and then you had the Eisler wing. That was the split, right? And so within, literally the CP, you had the two wings. I mean, the Blitzstein Eisler wing, and then the Seeger wing, and the Seegers, both father and son. And that's the one that seems to have at least won the internal battle in the movement itself, say during the 40s and the 50s. The consequence, that had consequences. And I think that's what you're pointing towards, right? And that the consequences are the ones that we're kind of living with now, maybe. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that that the direction that the movement took would be one that the Seegers would really approve of. And that's interesting, right?
What movement are you talking about when you say the movement?
Well, let's just say the left movement, left politics generally. So, still today, as you point out, I was at the rally a couple months ago at the Walmart, right? For the right? Well, what happened? The guy brought his guitar and he started singing Woody Guthrie songs, right? That's still what you get at that movement, right? They weren't singing Eisler songs, right? That we do know, right? I wish they were, but they weren't, right? Let me have my friend from Newton.
This was fascinating, really wonderful talk. Some of the people here who know me may be surprised to know that I'm a former musician and studied music theory and composition in college. And left it way behind, those who know me.
Good choice.
As a lawyer. But I think this is really fascinating. And one of the pieces that I think you didn't go into it could go into more perhaps, and as you're writing, there was also sort of different ethnic groups. This plays out differently. So just as some quick examples, so Jewish radicals in New York, a whole culture in New York City that sort of brought over from Europe and then developed in New York, part of this sort of high culture and this attachment to high culture and classical music and art and poetry and literature, which became then a big part of the working class culture in New York, right? And that, but very focused on the Jewish community. The Italian community, similarly, working class Italian community love of opera and knowledge of opera and devotion to opera also has sort of effects, I think throughout the working class culture in New York at least, and probably beyond.
Well, Schenectady, as we saw, right?
And in Schenectady. And then the African American community, I think similar, whether thinking about Paul Robeson and his concertizing of African American music, in the 20s when he started doing that. It was very important. He was, and also has been a casualty of McCarthyism. And nobody knows who he is. He was one of the most popular singers and performers in the country, in the late 40s. So anyway, I just think that adds a little, and I think for different other ethnic groups, there are similar kinds of stories.
No,
I think that adds some richness to it.
Right. I will just say I totally agree.
In terms of pro-worker songs and anti-capitalist songs, the RWW during the early 20th century popularized those kinds of songs inside their industrial union movements. But interestingly, they took old Protestant hymns for the tune and they put new anti-capitalist words into those songs. But to some degree, they did manage to reach the working class in that way.
Yeah. That's interesting. I always thought that the song Joe Hill was a wobbly song.
No,
Of course not. It's this guy.
it's written about him following
Yes,
his
of course
death.
it's about him.
Yeah.
But I thought it was contemporaneous, but it's, yeah, here it's that guy, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, right, well, the Little Red Songbook, of course. I mean, and it still circulates.
Yes.
I downloaded it from the internet just a couple months ago, right? Though it's continuously updated with Tin Pan Alley songs as well. Like, I mean, I think one of the most effective songs of that type we were talking about at a dinner was Brother Can Spare a Dime by Yip Harburg. So, you're absolutely right. Maybe they were the most successful, but there have been, continuations. I mean, every now and then somebody, gets a hit that's on a political topic. I'm sure you have your favorites. Whether people sort of circulate it and continue to sing it, I don't know if there have been hits to the same degree as the IWW achieved, and that's interesting if they haven't. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about how you breathe in basically the history of black music in this country, because I think because of racism, what's called classical has been actually considered like the European composers, and I remember having conversations, Bill Dixon, the black musician, he and I used to talk about this all the time. He insisted on calling it black music.
Yeah.
But also, so that our classical music is, say, Duke Ellington,
Yeah.
who was never elevated. So black music actually hasn't gotten the respect, you can probably say, or the recognition that when we say classical, what is our classical music in this country, and how does it fit in?
Well, there are those who would say, Ken Burns' documentary on jazz calls jazz America's classical music.
Yeah.
That's what he refers to.
And so there has to be some...
I don't know if, it is certainly respectable, but, again, it's, I bring your attention to, the very last thing, right, which is this. This could also, this graph, if you turned it upside down, could also indicate the percentage of the African American population that's in prison. Right? Right? So as the achievements of certain individual African Americans, like Wynton Marsalis won the Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago, are celebrated, the conditions of the broad base have deteriorated. So it's a similar phenomena as this, right? The working class wins the cultural battle, but they lose the war that matters.
What do you think of that?
Well, I would say that's how neoliberalism really works, which is that you concede certain insignificant territory, but the territory that really matters, which is this, that's where you turn the screws. Okay?
Yeah.
Right? I think that's really a crucial fact, to remember. And I think it's absolutely true, with African American. So you celebrate the achievements of individual African Americans. You make one of them president, right? But as he's president, you have the fewest number of pardons for prisoners of any president in history. The number of incarcerations of African Americans goes up. You have the largest decline in African American wealth in the history of the country. This is true, right? Well, right? Under our current president.
What is the role of music?
Oh, well, music, I'm saying, that's part of the piece. You win you can reward individual achievement, right, in the cultural sphere, right? And you promote certain cultural icons while ignoring the conditions of the mass. Okay? So, you win you concede you concede the concert halls to the working class. Yeah? But this is what you do to them economically. This is so the compensation you get for that is this. That's sort of the big point, I think.
So that's your point?
Yeah, that's kind of the big point. This is what you get. This is what you get for that. That's the trade-off.
But doesn't music play a role in community, in building protests, in bringing people together in solidarity?
In principle, it can, but it also divides people, and that's an important thing to remember. Now, here's a really good example. This is from another article I wrote in New Politics. Take the Pennsylvania Station in New York, which I'm sure we all know, right? When you go into Pennsylvania Station, what music do you hear? Probably don't even notice.
Classical.
You got it, right? Why do they pipe in classical music? Because it makes the African American homeless people the most uncomfortable and makes them, that's absolute, I mean, this is crowd control, right? This is weaponized classical music. Classical music is a weapon. And it's used, right? I mean, and it's no, if you want to drive certain kinds of populations from some place, you know, where you don't want them there, you play them music they don't want to hear. Okay? So music can function to unite, but it can crucially function to divide, and we can all, you know, you always have to keep that in mind. Yeah, yeah.
First, I have to start this by saying I'm depraved on the piano. I was deprived.
Deprived from the piano.
I grew up with. We grew up with a lot of knowledge of classical music, and I guess I'm going to. I'm glad that's not, you're not saying that's cause and effect, that rock and roll kind of caused wages to slide in the U.S. And now I'm really happy with the end there. But I'm really struggling with, I guess, having grown up working class. I felt shut out from classical music, and I listen to it in the morning when I wake up, and I've gone to classical concerts, and I enjoy classical music. But I almost feel like that it's an elitist thing. I mean, I don't know a lot of women, you know, black people that are in the WMHT lineup in the morning. It's such an exclusive canon.
Yeah.
Like, you know, kind of like the way literature, people started screaming, how about a black woman author getting in there? It just seems the whole, I mean, but I understand you're composers and you're coming from such a different thing, but to me, it's like, well, first of all, these words, they're singing words, and the words might be, when is my boyfriend coming home from World War II, to, I have to go to this friggin' factory, and now the factory's closed down, or whatever the songs are singing, is more than people's music to me. I mean, I don't know, it's just, I guess I feel like there's a judgment about that the classical music's like the only music, in a sense, in some of the presentations.
There what? No, I'm not approving of that. I'm just saying, in the 1930s, you know, if you asked somebody what is the best music, right? They would say Beethoven. You know, they would say Brahms or something, right? You know, if you were to listen to or rate it.
Charleston, though, no?
Well, that's, no, I don't know if they would. They would say, I like the Charleston, right? But there was a difference between the music that you would, I mean, hear me out on this, because I think there's something there, right? People would distinguish between, you know, what is the best, the most authentic musical masterpieces, which you might find alienating and difficult. You might not like them at all, right? But you recognize them as important achievements, right? And then there's the music that you like could be independent of that, right?
That's what you were told.
That's what you were exactly, right? I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that was the perception,
people
right?
Internalized
and people internalized it, right? Now the question is whether there was some basis for them thinking that. That's a sort of independent question, but that was widely believed, okay? How are you going to deal with that? One way of dealing with that is that you would provide people the ability to appreciate it. And that's what happened at the Union Hall in Schenectady, New York. And that's what happened at the worker schools in New York, right? To bring audiences in so that they understand the music from the inside and they didn't feel alienated and shut out from it. You know, that was the idea. Okay.
Isn't there different music for different needs? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, but there was a concert experience, and you know, I mean, certainly people that go to concerts also will go to the dance hall or something. You know, back then, right?
Yeah, right.
And you know, they had different functions, but there was this one kind of elevated function, a kind of church of music, and you went there to worship, you know, musical masterpieces. Okay? Yeah, John.
Well, I hear the arguments that people are making, but I still think the essential point is that at one time in the working class there were people like Connolly who was an autodidact, didn't go to college, but mastered literature and writing, and was very well read and knew history, and that extended to the cultural field. You know, so that they're working people like Connolly. He was not. There were many workers like him at the time, who confronted with the capitalist system, challenged themselves to master great literature, great music, etc. Well, I don't think we have that today, and there needs to be. What's that?
Worker intellectuals. There was
right.
a term that was used.
And that coincided with the high points of the workers' movement, and that's the point that we need to think about. Oh man,
what tune is that?
It's not happening now.
Sorry about that. I put it on vibrate. That's the point, and I think that's what that graph is all about.
I agree. I mean, that, but I'm not going to convince everybody in this room of that,
Right.
and it's going to take a couple of papers before I convince anybody at all, I think. Yeah.
I might be really far afield, and I never had a music theory or anything like that, so this is just kind of an observation, but the Beatles, which really did have huge impact and helped to create the social movement, kind of co-opted classical into the music that they were writing for the very first time in the 60s. And then, when I'm thinking about what you're saying, and then John Lennon eventually got back around to this place where he was sitting with acoustic guitar and singing that a working class hero is something to be. And he, at that point in time, was very rich.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, where his consciousness was going with that. We have a pretty good idea where it was, but,
what can I say? They were really interesting.
Absolutely.
And they were, this is the music I grew up on, and I regarded them as deeply political.
Yeah.
When I was 9 years old, I sort of knew enough to know that there was a political, that it rested on a foundation, on a philosophical foundation. It wasn't just like, these are nice tunes that I wanted to hear. This was tied into much broader kind of cultural currents that I wanted to get behind in 1969. Yeah.
I just have one more question. I love classical music, early music, Baroque music, and I do a lot of dancing about those time periods, and I know a little bit about it. And it grieves me when I go to Tanglewood or concerts and stuff, and I don't see these young people loving this music. I know this is sort of not even what we're talking about right now, but what do you think is going to be happening to this classical music?
Yeah, I know. I teach at a conservatory of music that puts the word conservative in conservative. We are so traditional and so conservative, you would not believe, Oh yeah, this is, this Bard, it's, the conservator. We have this president, right, this guy Botstein, he's a conductor, and this is, he has extremely traditional views about what this music should be and what musical education should be, which is to say, if you're a violinist, you learn to play the Izai sonatas, you learn to play Sigourney-Weisen, you play this virtuosic literature, you play chamber music, 19th century, the core of it is the common practice period from Bach to whatever, Mahler or something like that, with a couple of contemporary pieces thrown in along the way, but very traditional. Where is it? I have no idea. But, is it financially viable? Of course not. It's crazy. Could anybody go to a conservatory? Yeah, I'd be completely nuts to go to a conservatory, right? No question about it. It'd be insane, orchestras will begin to drop like flies, but mainly because the elite culture is now starting to reject them. Like rich people, if you look, go to the last page. Always most interesting part of the program, this is the last pages where you look at the donors lists, or orchestras, right? And you see who's giving money, and it's old money, It's not, you don't see new names. And now they give money to things. So I'll give you an example. A guy named Paul Allen, who's one of the Microsoft guys, there's Gates and Allen, who's the second guy. So for years, like the Seattle Symphony was going after him to give money. No, zero, nothing, okay? Who does he give money to? The Experience Music Museum in Seattle, which is their rock and roll museum. He gave, whatever, $20 million to that, right? In other words, for him, that's musical high culture, right? So the notion of classical music as having kind of a lock on musical high culture, even among elite classes, is really weakening, right? That's interesting. Yeah?
I'm still trying to figure out how to phrase the question, but I guess so you have the graph, like kind of like the correlation between like the rise of, I guess, like more mainstream popular kind of music and declining wages. But I'm kind of curious as to why there's also seemingly now currently like a dearth of mainstream, well, I guess, like worker songs, more or less. Maybe like Springsteen and like Obama and that's whatever, and whoever on the campus for, these kind of like really very flaccid kind of political songwriters now. I guess, do you see any kind of like correlation with that?
I think there are probably people in this room who could speak to this much better than I can, but I think, part of the issue is this question of worker self-consciousness, meaning the awareness of workers as a class, right?
Broken during those years of McCarthy, I think much more profoundly than we really understand. I mean, I never thought of it in terms of music, so you're gonna have to finish that book, so.
Yeah.
But, I think workers lost their identity way deeper than we know. I mean, we know those years happened and now we got better. But no, I don't think we ever did really get better. I don't think we ever gained our identity back as a class.
Yep.
And so without an identity as a class, we don't know who we're supporting. When the Vietnam War comes along, okay, we're against the Vietnam War. And so things come, but as ourselves as a class, we don't know ourselves anymore. And back before those days, it's very interesting to me to think that as a class, we felt that we had the right to listen to great music, that we didn't feel alienated from it. We said, God damn it, I can listen to this stuff too, and we can play it ourselves. Yeah. I'm just winging it here, I don't really know, but that's sort of what I'm hearing you say.
No, that's, as I said, there are people that could speak to this better than I. I think that's really true, this notion of a self-conscious worker's identity. I identify myself as part of this class. Well, of course, that's what made Occupy so powerful, right? We are the 99%.
And then also to yours, I'm thinking, I'm too old to really have gotten into the hip-hop movement. It's very political, So I think there is a political element.
It's just not mainstream.
Did anybody go to the May Day New York Occupy rally? I was there. I took my kid out of school, and last May Day, the Occupy New York City. So it was a concert. It was fantastic. So they had a guy named Immortal Technique. He's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, this was like, I'm old, I forget things, so it's like people say, oh, well, what great political music have you heard? And I just sort of forget, well, that was like really compelling, right? And wasn't he like thrown off the stage at some Obama, at the Obama inauguration? Or is that the other guy?
It was Loopy Fiasco.
Oh, Loopy Fiasco, yeah, he's also an Occupy guy, right.
Well, the coup,
The coup, yeah, oh yeah, the guillotine, I mean, that's my favorite song. I have a little Facebook group with 35 members called Guillotine Mais Bien Sûr. And that's our theme song, we got the guillotine, you better run. Yeah. Oh, it's great. He's awesome. I mean, he's a genius, this guy, Boots Riley.
What's his name?
Boots Riley.
The band is the coup.
The Coup is his band, but he's a laborer. I mean, he's Occupy, he's sort of organized Occupy Oakland. He's just utterly brilliant.
But I think a lot. I mean, that is like you're saying, that's kind of alternative hip hop, and there's some great examples. But mainstream hip hop is like it's very concerned with economics. It's saying there's nowhere for us. It's all that music is about. There's nowhere in there's no economic opportunity apart from
Well, get
selling
rich,
drugs.
get rich or die trying.
Right, I mean, and
Right?
that's
Get
what's
rich,
been
you know.
propagated, but I mean, that's what's out there.
Yeah, it's
workers' music.
a reflection.
There's no jobs.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It is. Yeah, I mean, I've always right. I find it really hard to listen to, not because I don't like it, but for exactly that reason. I find it incredibly depressing. I mean, much more depressing than Mahler. You know, Mahler's plenty depressing. You know, but this is like there really is no end. There's just nothing. It's incredibly dark. So, yeah.
Well, working class heroines.
Well, yeah, Born in the USA is pretty dark.
People that are in those places like to sing those songs because it makes them feel like they aren't the only ones. So somebody wrote that song. And that's why I think folk music, people's music, whatever you want to call it, does work for people, because people that are not, you know, having a great time, because it gives them music that they can identify with. And I think that that classical thing, you started out saying people always had to bow and kiss the feet of the wealthy in order to make a living being classical composers. And then you ended up saying it's, I mean, it sort of seemed to me like nothing's changed. You know, it's the same thing. It's still elite that have that, and that's why classical music has never been considered working class music, because it isn't. It never has been.
You don't have the leisure time if you're a worker. If you're a worker to learn something.
Well, not just leisure time, but the point is, it's like reading, you know, heavy duty college material. If you haven't had that education, you can't understand it. And I did want to throw in that there's the civil rights movement. You know, there's also this thing called People's Music Network, which is a international organization of people that use music for political purposes, and Pete Seeger was one of the co-founders of it, and it's still very much in existence, and there's lots and lots of people, a lot of those Occupy musicians are part of it. So there are a lot of, but, you know, they don't get the recording contracts from the big corporate, you know, organizations like Clearwater, or Clear Channel, and stuff like, you know, there's a reason why you don't hear a lot of workers' music on the radio, because they don't get, you know, Ani DeFranco has her own label because that's the only way to do it. But the black people, when they were fighting for their rights, and even before that, they were using music all the time as part of their movement. And you know, the civil rights movement showed how strong. Now it's true, Pete Seeger sort of reformulated "We Shall Overcome" into the national anthem of the civil rights movement. So I mean, you know. But still, "Wade in the Water" and all those other songs were huge in that movement. Without that music, a lot of African Americans will say this, because I've heard them say it over and over again in public presentations. Without their songs, they could have done that movement. And where did that music come from? It came from their churches, and that, you know, they grew up singing in church music, which a lot of it was classical. There's a lot of really good classical pianists that come out of black churches and singers. And so, you know, they're not rich, they're not elite, and they're not particularly European classical.
Oh, some of them are. But I mean, Leontine Price.
Right,
You know.
But the point is that I think they showed that the civil rights movement showed how powerful music can be if it's accessible to everybody.
Yeah. We all agree. I mean, that's.
But the classical stuff is not accessible to everybody. It just isn't, and it never will be. And I grew up with it. You know, I love.
Well, I mean, hang on. Da 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 da.
Singing, yes, but not.
It's a clap. Well, that's the finale of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
It's accessible in the fact that you can listen to it.
Da da da. Right? I mean, it's still around, you know, in some way.
Okay, let's take two more people, and then we'll close up. So 1 and 2.
So I was going to say, another thing you might consider looking at that graph too is, and the response and divergence from people sort of continuing to focus on classical music, is maybe the sexual revolution too. People gravitating towards music that you respond to physically and emotionally in a different way, coming right at the same time where mores were changing, again, like culturally, like, and the civil rights movement in there too, like various barriers in society were falling down, and there were many more options of who to associate with, what you can do yourself, what you can do with your body, and I think a lot of the crucial festivals too were kind of right around that 1970 time where people are like, I can do what I want. I can listen to music and dance publicly and take my top off. And, and again, that's sort of the high culture of that traditionally classical music environments didn't allow that sort of freedom.
Yeah, it's associated with repression, right?
Yes.
And like self-denial, you know, right? That's absolutely true. That's high culture traditionally has been associated. Well, it's not that way anymore, right? Goldman Sachs guys are not big into self-denial and repression, as you probably know. I mean, they're right.
Your point about capitalism, I think, is it appropriates everything. So basically, something that might have been revolutionary or gotten people through the day, you know, in the 30s or whatever, you'll hear it on Muzak now, or you can hear a Pete Seeger song or a Guthrie song. And it's been appropriated by capitalism, which doesn't mean that other songs won't come along. I mean, that graph, as depressing as it is, it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be, as you said, aren't going to be musicians that will give music to new movements, and they will have a part in moving people's lives forward. But then, until capitalism is gotten rid of, it's going to use this. I mean, it uses everything. It uses, think about other movements. The women's movement got appropriate. Just gets appropriated. So.
Yeah, look, I'm a radical in these. I found Pete Seeger's appearance at Obama's inauguration one of the most depressing things I've ever seen. It was disgusting. I just thought it was vile. I mean, everybody thought, oh, big triumph. Yeah. Well, it's like exactly that. Capitalism has now totally co-opted this sentiment. And he even sang the famous last verse of "This land is my land," right? About the no private property. On the other side, the sign said nothing. Right? He even sang it. It made no difference. Right? I mean, right. So just at that point, that's when African American wealth, dropped by 25% in the next 2 years. Right? That's that. After singing in that song. So yeah, capitalism appropriates everything.
Okay, let's take the last question.
Well, it's not really a question, but it just
Or
what
comment?
other people have said brings to mind. I know a little bit about music, but I also know more about theater, and I know that in the same sense of in this country, going to a classical concert is considered. People who are in the elite class go to classical concerts. People in the elite class go to theater. But that's not true in other countries. Yeah. And I know your paper is really about this country, but I'm just sort of interested in, maybe you might be interested also in not just music, but the arts as well. Obviously your specialty is music, but why is it that in other countries people go to the theater who are working class, who are poor? It's cheaper, right? So in
More
terms
socialist
of,
there.
is classical music accessible? Well, is classical music more accessible in other countries? I don't know that. I do know that in other countries, theater is not considered just for the elite.
Yeah, for sure.
My guess would be that music might be similarly defined.
There are many more civilized countries than ours.
I'd like to thank John for a really informative. If you'd like to get a ticket to the rally in Syracuse, go to the Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace table up here.